He grew up with nothing. Worked every table, took every order, smiled through every insult. She looked him dead in the face and laughed. "You'll always be a waiter." What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that he owned every single room she was standing in. Stay with me. Because this story, it doesn't end the way you think it does. "You'll always be a waiter," she said, not knowing he owns the hotel. She laughed right in his face. Not a little laugh, not an awkward chuckle, a full, cold, cruel laugh, the kind that's meant to cut deep and stay there. "You'll always be a waiter," she said, loud enough for everyone in that room to hear, loud enough to make the other guests look over, loud enough for the hostess to freeze mid-step and stare at the floor. The man in the white dress shirt just stood there, holding the wine bottle, a slight smile on his face, the kind of smile that knows something everyone else in the room doesn't. He didn't flinch, didn't drop his eyes, didn't apologize. He simply set the wine bottle down on the table, straightened his cuffs, and said very quietly, "Yes, ma'am. Can I get you anything else?" She waved him away like he was invisible. Nobody in that room had any idea what they had just witnessed. Nobody knew that in less than 48 hours, that woman's entire world was about to fall apart because of the man she just humiliated. But before we get there, we need to go back to where this story really begins. Back to a small town in Ohio, back to a little boy with big dreams and an empty stomach, back to the beginning. His name was Thomas Cole, but everybody who loved him called him Tommy. Tommy grew up in a small house on Birchwood Street in Dayton, Ohio. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the linoleum was always peeling near the stove. His father worked long shifts at a bottling plant. His mother cleaned houses 3 days a week. They weren't poor in the way you see in movies, they just never had enough. Never quite enough for new shoes, never quite enough for the field trips, never quite enough to stop worrying. But Tommy never complained, not once. At 12 years old, he was already bagging groceries on weekends at the Food King on 5th Street. At 14, he was mowing lawns. At 16, he got his first real job bussing tables at a local diner called Pearl's. And the thing about Tommy Cole was this: he watched everything. He watched how the owner of Pearl's, a woman named Doris, would walk the floor every single morning before they opened, checking every table, running her finger along the baseboards, adjusting the salt shakers so they were exactly 1 inch from the edge. He watched how she handled difficult customers, how she handled the staff, how she handled the money. He was 16 years old, bussing tables for $4.50 an hour. But in his mind, in that quiet, fierce, watching mind of his, he was already studying. He was already learning how to run a business. Fast forward 10 years. Tommy Cole is 26 years old. He's living in Chicago. He's working as a waiter at a mid-range hotel restaurant called the Bristol Room. Nice place, white tablecloths, piano on Friday nights. He's good at the job, really good. The kind of waiter who remembers your name and your usual order after 1 visit. The kind of waiter who can carry 6 plates and make it look effortless. But here's the thing almost nobody knew about Tommy Cole. For the past 4 years he had been saving, quietly, intensely, the way only people who grew up with nothing know how to save. He had 2 roommates. He drove a 2004 Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it. He made his own lunch every day. He didn't own a single piece of name-brand clothing. And he was investing, reading everything he could find: real estate, stock market, business loans, small acquisitions. He had a notebook, one of those cheap black and white composition notebooks, filled front to back with calculations, ideas, and notes. His coworkers used to joke about it, call it Tommy's little notebook of crazy. But Tommy Cole wasn't crazy. Tommy Cole was building something. It happened in February, cold Tuesday morning. Tommy was wiping down tables before the lunch rush when his manager, Greg, came over and said there was someone in the lobby asking for a tour of the property. "Not a guest," Greg said, puzzled. "Says he's interested in a private sale. Corporate got a call this morning. They want someone to show him around." Tommy volunteered. The man in the lobby was named Arthur Briggs, 72 years old, soft-spoken. He wore a simple brown overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that had clearly seen better decades. He looked like someone's retired grandfather. Tommy shook his hand and introduced himself, and then he did what Tommy always did: he listened. Arthur Briggs talked about the hotel the whole time, not like a buyer inspecting a product, more like a man visiting an old friend. He pointed out where the original crown molding had been replaced. He noticed the water stain near the second-floor elevator that had been painted over twice. He ran his thumb along a banister in the stairwell and said, quietly, "Good bones." Halfway through the tour, Tommy asked him a question, just one. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what are you looking for in a property like this? What would make it worth the investment?" Arthur Briggs stopped walking, turned around, looked at Tommy for a long moment, the way people look at you when they're deciding whether you're worth a real answer. Then he said, "Someone who cares about it the way it deserves to be cared for." They talked for another 2 hours after the tour was done, standing right there in the lobby. Tommy missed the entire lunch service. Greg was furious. Tommy didn't care, because Arthur Briggs handed him a business card before he left and said, "I want you to call me, not about the hotel, about something else." Tommy called him the next morning, 7 a.m. sharp. What Arthur Briggs told him over the next 4 phone calls changed Tommy Cole's life forever. Arthur Briggs had spent 40 years in hospitality. He had owned or co-owned 11 properties across the Midwest. He was 72 years old, his wife had passed the previous spring, and his one son had no interest in the business. He was looking for someone to mentor, someone hungry enough, someone who actually cared. And he had been watching Tommy during that entire tour. "Not the hotel, Tommy. I've met 1,000 people in this industry," Arthur told him on the 3rd call. "Most of them want money. Some of them want power. Very few of them actually love the work. You love the work. I could tell from the first 5 minutes." Over the next 2 years, Arthur Briggs became Tommy Cole's mentor, his guide, and eventually, after much convincing on both sides, his partner. Together, they bought their first property, a struggling 40-room hotel in Rockford, Illinois, run down, half empty, one negative Yelp review after another. Tommy moved into a room on the 3rd floor and ran the place himself, every single day, greeting guests at the front desk, helping the kitchen staff, renegotiating with vendors, redesigning the breakfast menu. Within 18 months, that hotel had a 4.7-star rating and a waiting list on weekends. Arthur Briggs watched all of this and smiled. "You ready for the next one?" he asked. Tommy just picked up his little black notebook. "I was born ready," he said. And then things moved fast. Property 2, Property 3, a small boutique hotel in Indianapolis that Tommy transformed into one of the most talked-about weekend destinations in the state. By the time he was 31 years old, Thomas Cole was quietly, very quietly, one of the most successful independent hotel operators in the Midwest. But here's the crucial thing you need to understand. Tommy never changed. He still drove an old car. He still wore simple clothes. He didn't post on social media. He didn't go to industry galas or get his picture in magazines. He had a small office in a building most people would walk right past. His assistant, a sharp 24-year-old named Kayla, once told a journalist who tracked them down, "He doesn't really do public appearances." The journalist wrote it up anyway, called Tommy the invisible giant of Midwest hospitality. Tommy read the article, folded it up, and put it in his composition notebook. He didn't need anyone to know who he was. He already knew. And then came the phone call that brought everything full circle. The Bristol Room, the hotel in Chicago where he had worked as a waiter for years, the one where Arthur Briggs had first come to tour, the one where Greg had once yelled at him for missing the lunch rush. It was struggling, badly. The ownership group had made a series of terrible decisions, bad renovations, overpriced menus, revolving door of management. The place had lost its soul. Tommy got a call from the bank handling the distress sale. He bought it in 60 days. He didn't announce it. He didn't issue a press release. He simply filed the paperwork, transferred the funds, and started planning the renovation quietly from his office. He decided to keep the staff, all of them, even the ones who didn't know he was coming. He decided to start by walking the floor himself, every morning, before the restaurant opened, exactly the way Doris used to do at Pearl's Diner back in Dayton when he was 16 years old. He decided not to tell anyone who he was. Not yet. He would come in, wear the white shirt, carry the wine, watch, listen, feel the place. He had done this at every property he'd ever bought. He called it earning the room. And it worked every single time. Now, this is where Diane Whitmore enters the story. Diane was 44 years old. She had been a real estate broker in Chicago for 15 years. She was sharp, polished, and very good at her job, which had made her very comfortable. The kind of comfortable that sometimes makes people forget how to be kind. She had a table at the Bristol Room every Thursday evening. It was practically reserved for her. She used it for client dinners, power dinners, the kind where she was always the most important person at the table. She had been coming there for years, long enough that she'd watched the place slide, long enough to have real opinions about what was wrong with it, long enough to feel like she owned the place just a little, the way regulars sometimes do. She didn't know the hotel had just been sold. Nobody on the staff had announced it yet. That was Tommy's instruction: keep it quiet, let him observe first. The night she walked in, she had a table of 4. Clients from out of town. Big deal on the table. She was in full performance mode, the kind of dinner where every detail of the experience mattered because everything was a reflection of her. Tommy was on the floor that night, white shirt, wine bottle, watching. He came to her table and introduced himself. "Good evening. My name is Thomas. I'll be taking care of you tonight." And Diane Whitmore did something that made her clients shift uncomfortably in their seats. She looked him up and down, slowly, the way you look at something you're deciding whether or not to bother with. "Finally," she said, "the last waiter they had here didn't know the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. I'm assuming you do." "Yes," Tommy said simply. The dinner went fine. Tommy was attentive, knowledgeable, professional. He handled every one of Diane's corrections, and there were several with patience and grace. But as he was bringing the dessert menu, Diane's phone rang. It was her business partner, and Tommy caught just enough of the conversation to understand. Diane was apparently trying to broker a deal involving a commercial property in the River North District, a hotel conversion, and it wasn't going well. When she hung up, she was visibly annoyed. Her clients excused themselves to use the restroom, and Diane sat alone for a moment, looking out the window at the street below. Tommy set down the dessert menus quietly. "Long week?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and something behind her eyes shifted, not kindness exactly, but the brief lowering of a wall. "Do you know anything about hotel acquisitions?" she asked, almost like a joke. "A little," Tommy said. She laughed. "Right." She picked up her phone again. "No offense, but the last thing I need right now is advice from a waiter." Tommy just nodded. "Of course, can I bring anyone an espresso?" She came back the following Thursday. And the Thursday after that. And each time Tommy was there, patient, steady, professional. She started to soften. A little. The way people do when someone keeps showing up with warmth even after you've been unkind to them. She started talking to him. Not a lot. Brief exchanges before the table filled up. She told him about a client who'd backed out of a deal, about a renovation project that had gone over budget, about her ex-husband once by accident, and then changed the subject quickly like she'd said something she hadn't meant to. Tommy listened. He always listened. And then came the night that changed everything. The fourth Thursday, Diane came in with what was clearly the most important client she'd had in a long time, a developer named Frank Aldridge, who was in town from New York considering a major real estate investment in the Chicago market. This was Diane's big shot. She had been working toward this dinner for weeks. And the kitchen ran out of the dish Frank had specifically requested. Not a small thing. Frank had mentioned it when he sat down, made it a point. He'd heard this restaurant had the best braised short rib in the city, and now Tommy was standing at the table, telling him they'd had an unexpected rush and the kitchen was out. Diane's face went white. Frank frowned. Well, that's unfortunate. And then Diane did what she always did when things embarrassed her. She looked for something to blame. She turned to Tommy and, loud enough for Frank and both nearby tables to hear, she said, "You know, this is exactly the problem with this place. You've been here every week for a month. You'd think by now you'd know how to run a proper service. But I suppose this is what you get from a man whose entire career is taking orders." She paused. And then, and this was the part that landed like a stone in still water, she said, "You'll always be a waiter. Some people are just built that way." The table went silent. The nearby tables went silent. Tommy stood there, still, calm, the wine bottle in his hand. He looked at her, not with anger, not with hurt. With something much quieter than both of those things. "I'm sorry about the short rib, Mr. Aldridge," he said. "I'd like to offer you something better from our private menu with the restaurant's compliments. I think you'll be very pleased." Then he looked at Diane one more time, just a glance, a small, steady, unreadable glance. And he walked back to the kitchen. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, the Bristol Room hosted a small private breakfast meeting for the new ownership group and senior staff. It was a simple meeting, coffee, pastries, a conference room on the second floor. The general manager, a woman named Patricia, had prepared everyone. The new owner is coming in to introduce himself. He's been doing some quiet observing over the past few weeks, wants to meet the team. The staff filed in. 12 people, front of house manager, head chef, events coordinator, 3 servers. Diane Whitmore was not a staff member. But Diane Whitmore was there, because Frank Aldridge had reached out to the hotel directly after that dinner. He had been so impressed by the handling of the short rib situation, so impressed by the quiet dignity of the server who'd taken the blame for something he didn't deserve, that he'd called the hotel and asked to speak with management. And management, not knowing the full story, had forwarded his request to the new owner. And the new owner had invited Frank Aldridge to the breakfast meeting. And Frank had brought Diane. She walked in smiling, her good power breakfast smile, ready to network, ready to press the flesh with whoever this new ownership was. The door opened, and Thomas Cole walked in. He was wearing the same kind of simple clothes he always wore. He had his composition notebook tucked under his arm. He shook hands with Patricia, smiled warmly at the chef, nodded at the staff. Diane stared. Her brain tried to process what her eyes were showing her. Because the man who just walked in, the man Patricia was now introducing as the new owner and president of Cole Hospitality Group, was the waiter. Her waiter. The man she had told 2 nights ago that he would always be a waiter. The man she had humiliated in front of a table full of people. The man who owned the hotel she had been eating at for 3 years. Tommy shook hands around the room, professional, warm, present. He reached Diane last. He extended his hand, looked her in the eyes, and smiled, the same steady, quiet, unreadable smile she had seen across the restaurant floor. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "good to see you again. Frank tells me you've been incredibly helpful in getting him interested in this market. We'd love to talk more about a potential partnership." Diane Whitmore opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Her face was doing something between a smile and a wince, a desperate, scrambling expression that people get when they realize the ground has completely shifted beneath them, and there is no graceful way to land. Frank Aldridge, standing beside her, looked at them both with gentle confusion. "You two know each other?" Tommy looked at Diane calmly, let her answer. She cleared her throat. "We've crossed paths," she said quietly. Tommy just nodded, as if it were nothing, as if that night had never happened. As if he were still the most patient person in the room. Now here's where a lesser story would go in one direction. The revenge fantasy version, where Tommy humiliates Diane the way she humiliated him, where he uses his power to crush her deal, ruin her reputation, make sure she never eats at that restaurant again. But this isn't that story. Because Thomas Cole wasn't built that way. After the meeting, when the room was clearing out, Diane found him standing by the window with a coffee cup. She walked over and she didn't say anything clever. She didn't make an excuse. She didn't spin it. She just stood next to him for a moment and then said, "I'm sorry, what I said the other night was wrong, and it was cruel." Tommy looked at her for a moment. "I know you're sorry," he said, "and I accepted it before you said it." "Why?" she asked, "after how I spoke to you?" He thought for a second, then, "Because I grew up in a house where we didn't have a lot, and the people who were kind to me when I had nothing, those people changed my life. I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to be the other kind." Diane didn't say anything. She just looked out the window. After a moment she asked, "What do you do with people who aren't kind?" Tommy smiled. "I let them figure it out," he said. "Most people do eventually." Cole Hospitality Group went on to acquire 2 more properties that year, including a partnership deal structured partly through Frank Aldridge's investment firm. Diane Whitmore brokered the real estate transaction on the second one. She was professional, she was sharp, and she was from that point forward unfailingly kind to every single person in the room, regardless of what their job title said. Some lessons cost you nothing. You just read about them and absorbed them. Some lessons cost you everything. You learn them in a room full of people while your face turns red and you can't find a single word to say. Diane Whitmore paid the expensive kind, and she was grateful for it. But I want to tell you something before we close this story out, because I think there's something here that goes beyond the plot twist, beyond the gotcha moment, beyond the wow, she didn't know who she was talking to. Here's the truth. Tommy Cole wasn't powerful because he owned hotels. He was powerful long before that. He was powerful at 16, bagging groceries and watching how Doris ran her diner. He was powerful at 26, carrying wine bottles and filling a composition notebook with ideas. He was powerful the night Diane said what she said, because he stood there and answered with dignity when he could have answered with anger. You see, the cruelest thing about the way we treat service workers, the way some of us treat waiters, cleaners, drivers, grocery clerks, isn't just that it's rude. It's that it reveals something about us that we would rather nobody see. It reveals that we have confused value with visibility. It reveals that we have confused title with worth. Thomas Cole carried trays and poured wine, and he also built a business empire from nothing, mentored young people in the industry, gave Arthur Briggs's legacy something to live on, and treated every single person he encountered, from bus boy to billionaire, with the same quiet, steady decency. The waiter, the owner, the same man. There's a waiter out there right now, maybe serving your table, maybe scanning your groceries, maybe delivering your package in the rain, who is writing in a notebook at night, who is watching and learning and planning, who is building something that you will one day read about or walk into or benefit from. You will never know who they are, unless you treat them like they matter right now. Because here's what Tommy Cole knew, what he'd known since he was a 16-year-old kid at Pearl's Diner, watching Doris run her finger along the baseboard every morning. The way you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you. That's who you actually are. Not your title, not your resume, not your client list or your car or your table at the nice restaurant. Who you are, the real you, shows up in those small, invisible moments, when the camera is off, when no one important is watching, when all there is in the room is you and another human being who's just trying to do their job. Closing call to action and outro. If this story hit you, if it made you feel something, I want you to do something right now before you scroll away. Hit that like button, not for the algorithm, for Tommy Cole, for every person who ever got talked down to while they were building something extraordinary in silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, maybe someone who's been underestimated, maybe someone who needs a reminder to be kind, maybe both. And if you're new here, subscribe, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one, true to life, emotionally real, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the quiet dignity it takes to build something from nothing, about what it really means to win. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, the room is always watching. Make sure it sees the best of you.